Gorbachev warns the Allies they are going too far, and the U.S. military maps plans for a ground war sooner or later. This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting. Good evening. New diplomatic efforts to end the war in the Persian Gulf may be underway tonight. Soviet President Gorbachev said in Moscow he is sending his own envoy to Baghdad for talks with Saddam Hussein. He coupled that announcement with a charge that Allied military operations may have gone too far. But the disclosure came as Iran's policymakers were meeting in Tehran to study what is said to be Saddam's answer to their plan to end the fighting, and as one of Saddam's diplomats arrived in Jordan to brief officials there. Bill Plant has been tracking all this at the State Department today. Bill, first, what do you make of the Gorbachev statement?
Well, Bob, this was an unpleasant surprise for the Bush administration. The Secretary of State thought that he had put this particular fire out about 2 weeks ago when the new Soviet foreign minister was only hinting at what Gorbachev said today, that the Allied attacks against Iraq were going beyond the scope of the United Nations resolution. And at that time, Secretary Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Bezhmertnik met, and they agreed here in Washington on a joint statement which emphasized, among other things, that the coalition was seeking the liberation of Kuwait and not the destruction of Iraq. Now we have Gorbachev himself saying it, and although he did say that the Soviets remain committed in principle to the UN resolutions, he never specifically talked about Iraq withdrawing from Kuwait. So this will be seen here as a softening of the Soviet position, as Gorbachev giving in to pressure from his military and from those who don't want him marching in lockstep with the U.S. And the person that he'll most likely be sending as his personal envoy to Baghdad is Evgeny Primakov, who is seen here as someone who is most anxious to preserve Moscow's special former close relationship with Iraq. Something else which won't be well received here is today's meeting in Amman, Jordan, between Jordan's King Hussein and a top Iraqi official who had just come from that peace conference in Iran. The administration worries about any kind of solution which would allow Saddam to save face. The Iraqis, incidentally, Bob, formally notified the U.S. today that they are breaking diplomatic relations, an act which is at this point, of course, seen as more symbolic than anything else. Bob?
I guess the question, Bill, does anyone there have any idea what is in this so-called Iranian peace plan that Saddam has apparently replied to and which he is now sending his diplomats to Jordan to brief on?
Bob, at this point, no. But I have to tell you that there is no indication that they care very much what's in it either, because the position here has been and remains, and I think you'll hear the Secretary of State say it tomorrow, that none of this works unless Iraq gets out of Kuwait first. They don't want to let Saddam save his face or his rear.
Okay, thank you, Bill. President Bush's top military advisors spent most of the day being briefed by the Desert Storm commanders in Saudi Arabia. Based on what they're told, Defense Secretary Cheney and the Joint Chiefs Chairman Powell will decide when a ground war might start. Susan Spencer now with that.
The men who will help determine the course of this war posed for cameras this morning, then began intense briefings by all branches of the military, intelligence experts, and other Allied commanders. So engrossed were they that in the end they stood up troops at a nearby Patriot missile site, troops waiting for the VIPs to give them medals. The briefings went into the evening. Little was made public.
First of all, I don't know what they are discussing.
But the Central Command was awash with information seeming to point to ground assault sooner rather than later. The French displayed dramatic tape of the successful bombing of aircraft shelters. And as for the French ground troops,
my personal impression yesterday is that they are ready to go.
The Americans today had hard information on Iraqi weapons losses: 750 tanks, 650 artillery pieces, 600 armored personnel carriers, roughly 15